Was McLaren right on top in qualifying, as you would expect. Just a flashback to the sprint race today. Very boring it was too. Effectively, it was just a test session, I think, for most to make up for the lack of running on Friday that you get when it's a sprint weekend. Oscar Piastri won the race easily from George Russell, Lando Norris, Max Verstappen in fourth place. For a while, Max was pushing Lando reasonably hard in the early laps. I think that was more Lando just taking it very easy and inducing Max into using his tyres as much as possible. And thereafter, everybody cruised. Right at the end of the race, a few of the rabbits at the back put on soft tyres, I guess just to get a feel for the soft going into qualifying later in the evening. And I thought it was quite interesting that on his second last lap, Oscar Piastri almost matched the time set by, for example, a Pierre Gasly on a new set of softs. And at this point, of course, his mediums, his used mediums, he started on used mediums, most of them were pretty much at the end of their life. And Oscar just pulled out 0.8 of a second. That just showed how much margin McLaren had. And they took that into qualifying. Lando took a little bit of time to get up to speed, as you would expect. He's got a mentality, I think, this weekend of, if it is again going to be an Oscar weekend, and there was no reason to think that on a circuit like this, all about high-speed commitment, that Oscar wouldn't be right there. Lando, I think this weekend, very happy just to finish behind Oscar, if that's what happens. Push him a little bit, maybe, when it comes to strategy at the end of the 25-lap runs, things like that. But there's not a lot of cards with which to play. And if Lando has to finish second tomorrow to Oscar Piastri, I don't think that'll be a big disaster for him. And from McLaren's point of view, to go into the last race with Lando still having a healthy lead, but still potentially able to lose it to Oscar, I think McLaren will feel they've done their job then, and the cards will fall where they may, and there'll be no recriminations at all, I think, if Oscar does win this. And I don't think there'll be any orders or anything like that. I'm sure there won't be any orders. It'll just be a straight race, apart from the reality of the first corner, where anything can happen, of course, and Max Verstappen still mathematically in it. So let's have a look at those laps. Oscar Piastri, very, very good. And it was about high-speed commitment. And at one point, Will Joseph, Lando's engineer, did say, you've seen the overlays, Lando. It is about high-speed commitment. And Lando thereafter did a very, very good lap. He didn't do a good second lap in Q3. He understeered a little bit wide of the turn-in point going into turn 2, of all places, not a particularly dramatic corner. Ran wide and then aborted that lap. And that was the lap in which Oscar then retook the pole position, which Lando had got on his first run. And I think the track was a little bit quicker there. We shouldn't read too much into it. Although fastest in Sector 1, right at the end, was indeed Max Verstappen. We'll get on to Max in a second. So Lando in the pits when Oscar went past the checkered flag to take the pole, and McLaren will start 1-2, a perfect situation for them on a circuit in which they appear to be completely and utterly dominant. P3, Max Verstappen, very good P3, given where he was in the sprint, complaining still about massive bouncing in the car. They managed to get that out, it appears, by and large, for qualifying. Not necessarily by reducing the ride height. They might have done that. Very difficult to know. They might have reduced, for example, the heave stiffness on the car. Difficult to say, but Max not complaining anymore about bouncing, complaining more at the beginning of qualifying, going into Q2 indeed, about the effect of downshifts on the way the car was moving under braking, something he said he'd never really felt before, and obviously quite a lot of work going on there. Effectively, Red Bull, having got rid of the bouncing, starting to set the car up in the middle of Q2. That shows where Red Bull were, and of course, as it went on, Max got quicker and quicker. I'm not sure there was a lot more in the car than we saw from Max, but a very good lap, but indicative of the way Red Bull have to be so careful with their tyres is that Max and George Russell too were doing preparation laps out of the pits before they did the first quick lap, whereas McLaren able to go out of the pits and then effectively the first flying lap is their first push lap. That just shows how much work Red Bull have to do to get the tyres absolutely into the window. Going back to the McLarens, another interesting message from Will Joseph to Lando was when he was trying to get him up to speed compared with Oscar, looking at the overlays. He said, and let's get rid of that coasting going into the last corner, Lando. Just be a little bit more aggressive with the throttle, or use the throttle more, activate the throttle more. I think he said something like that, which was a reference to something that I've often talked about with Lando and how good that is, I think, as part of Lando's repertoire, which is this ability to brake and then not to be touching the brake or the throttle for a millisecond or two, maybe up to a second. I doubt it's a second on some of these demanding corners, which do require a lot of commitment and finesse. And that's Lando just letting the car settle, letting the tyres feel the surface of the road, and then he's feeling that. And he does that incredibly well. And I was looking at all the traces, and I'm pleased to report that Lando didn't seem to respond to that, because he was doing exactly the same after the Will Joseph message as he was before, from the telemetry that I can see going into that last corner. But here's the interesting thing. Both Max and Oscar were also doing exactly what Lando does into turn 17. They're also letting the car float. So I think Lando does that very naturally, and Max doesn't do it as much, and Oscar certainly doesn't do it as much. But certainly through 17, they all look like Lando clones going through there. I mean, it was a little bit unsettling to hear GP talking to Max about minimum speed and turn in a bit later here and do this, all these sort of minute instructions. It's no surprise in a way, because the car is still very, very difficult. It's also that sort of circuit where it's a very sort of telemetry driven digital circuit where finesse and touch doesn't actually add up to very much. And I think that's a characteristic of this circuit. I think it kind of reduces to a lower, not the lowest, but a lower common denominator, the skills involved by the drivers. And it just shows how expansive I think that Max's mind is, that he can respond to all that. And this is the ultimate feel and touch driver, being driven by telemetry and numbers going around the lap, and still obviously relying on quite a lot of touch to do it. And but they can get so much information on a lap like this, on a circuit like this, on the pit wall, that the drivers just have to work within that, unless you're Lando Norris being told not to coast as much going through 17. So, yeah, I mean, Max, interestingly, it took him 2 corners to get past Yuki in the sprint race. You recall that he was out-qualified by Yuki yesterday by a couple of thousandths. And Yuki duly did a good job he was on the outside, and Max sort of went down the inside, but then Yuki sort of went round his outside on the first corner. You thought, oh, well, that's quite brave of Yuki. They hit to turn 2, and Yuki sort of runs wide, and Max does a undercut, and there he is straight up inside him going into turn 3. So very impressive opening half lap by Max. Fernando Alonso made a terrible start in the sprint race as well, finished, struggling. And Lewis Hamilton, just while we're on the sprint, he started at the back, as you know, and indeed they changed the setup of the car, so he started from the pit lane. But he couldn't do anything about Lance Stroll. He was behind Lance Stroll, and it was a DRS train, but he couldn't do anything about Lance Stroll. What does that tell you? And then let's get on to Ferrari in qualifying, because Charles Leclerc just made it through to Q3, had to use all his new sets of softs to do it, had no new sets left for the final part of qualifying. I mean, what does that tell you, first of all, about Ferrari? He also had a massive lose in Q3 as well, presumably because he was on these used softs trying to wring everything he could out of them. And it was a really vicious lose. He went wide over a curb. I don't know what corner it was. They all look the same, don't they? But then it was a sort of snap over correction and flick back the other way. And you just, my immediate thought was, wow, it's so good that we have all this runoff area. Imagine if Charles had that moment on a circuit with any sort of barrier anywhere near it. That was a really high speed, very, very vicious spin. And Charles eventually qualified 10th, as he would, on the scrub softs in a very, very bad Ferrari. It's all you can say. And yet again, Lewis Hamilton did not get out of Q1. He was actually a little bit quicker than Charles on his first run in Q1. And you thought, oh, well, this may be okay for Lewis. Maybe he'll get into Q2. But then they went out on their new softs at the end of Q1. And Lewis didn't go any quicker, did exactly the same time. Charles found 3/10, as he does. And Lewis, had a bit of traffic, but then traffic isn't that much of an issue these days. There's so much. Well, I say that. There was a bit of a GPS issue today. So maybe in fairness to Lewis, maybe the traffic did slow him, because he was quite good in Sector 1, but when he got the traffic, he lost 2 or 3 tenths. And that was enough for him not to make it out of Q1. So, okay, jury's out. Maybe the GPS, maybe the traffic was terrible. It looks like he's in a mode now of saying, well, I'm not allowed to say anything. So I'll say that for him. For all Lewis fans out there was a little bit of saving grace, not much. Anyway, didn't make it out of Q1 again. Just terrible. And Lance Stroll didn't make it out of Q1 again. And this time he was saying, instead of yesterday when he was saying, didn't get traffic, didn't get the tyres up, he just said, I can't go any quicker. I cannot go any quicker. I don't know what's the problem. And so my thought to that was, and this in many ways could be the sort of central theme of of this Grand Prix weekend is Adrian Newey in his first race, new role as team principal, there on the pit wall. I think he's actually wearing Aston Martin kit as well. And imagine Fernando Alonso makes it through to Q3, and Lance Stroll, the son of the man who basically owns the team, who without whom the team wouldn't even exist, whose one goal in life now is to have his son win a Grand Prix, and if he can win a Grand Prix, win a World Championship. That's, I'm sure, what he's still thinking. Adrian Newey, welcome to the land of explanations when you have to say to Lawrence Stroll what the problem is with his son Lance and why he's only in Q1 and Fernando gets through to Q3. I'd be interested to see that one. I don't think Adrian will be saying very much other than grunting a little bit and moving on. That'd be my opinion. But then again, it is the owner of the team. So, there's got to be a little bit of an issue going on there. So welcome to the big time, Adrian, is all I can say. So let's just have a look at the grid. So let's look at the grid otherwise. George Russell looked pretty good. I was a bit surprised right at the end. He was out right at the end of Q3, timed it perfectly from Mercedes track being quick point of view. Only did the same time as Max, a 19.6, which compared with Oscar's 19.3, it was quite a big gap. I was surprised by that. And also it does indicate, obviously, they do have some tyre issues still because they too were doing a prep lap. Except, of course, right at the end of Q3, because when Charles went off, there was lots of debris all over the circuit, barge boards and stuff, and the red came out, which meant that for that final run, there was only 5 minutes. There was no time to do a prep lap, and the brakes were cold, and it was difficult. Max did the time, but he did it as part of the rising graph of the setup on the Red Bull, which had really only started at the beginning of qualifying, whereas I think not having that prep lap hurt Mercedes and George Russell more. George was complaining again about weird steering, which is obviously something that he talked a lot about on the radio in Vegas, and the inconsistency of the stiffness of the steering, the feel of the steering, and he was talking about it again. Kimi Antonelli had a time deleted, but then got back, did a very good job, just slower than George. Isaac Hadjar, fabulous job in the Racing Bulls. Any team actually to bring any sort of upgrade to this circuit. Call it an upgrade. I call it good old Dan Gurney. It's just Gurney flaps on the front flaps. And that is named after Dan Gurney, for those that don't know. And there is a story behind that. And on this channel, actually, I've got an interview with Dan when he describes the discovery of the Gurney flap. So if you search through my YouTube channel, you will come to that point. Fernando 20.5, Carlos Sainz 20.7, another good job. Few dramas with a so-called unsafe pit release. Pierre Gasly into Q3 with an Alpine Renault. Lewis Hamilton in a Ferrari, not out of Q1. Whoa. And then Charles Leclerc, P10 in the other Ferrari. Not happy at all, as you can imagine. So, yeah, I think this race will be, it looks like it'll be an Oscar walkover, assuming there are no glitches with pit stops. And this whole 25 lap thing means that Oscar can go pretty hard on the tyres and not have to worry about him too much. So it looks like it's a pretty straightforward race for him. I don't think Lando will be upset at all to be finishing second, but he needs to finish second, obviously, just to be, just to make sure that everyone knows who's boss as they go into Abu Dhabi. And, Max against George, be an interesting race. So, yeah, there we are. Look forward to that tomorrow. Don't forget to have a look in the description below this video at the latest watches from REC. They specialize, wonderful small Danish company. They specialize in DNA from interesting racing cars and road cars and putting that DNA. It might be, in the case of the Ayrton Senna Lotus 98T Renault, it's the aluminium from the plenum chambers that were actually on the car, on the engine. And it can be brakes, it can be any aspect of the car. And the two watches that are currently being designed and built, one is around the Ford Mustang used by Steve McQueen in the amazing movie Bullet. And of course the other car is the Datsun 240Z as it was probably called in the United States, when it was dominating production racing in the early 70s in the hands of John Morton, preparation by Peter Brock. Both of those guys, Carroll Shelby disciples. And what a car that was. That transformed the way I think many Americans thought about the Japanese car market, this Datsun 240Z coming over, or being built in America effectively, but prepared in America and dominating racing as it did. They suddenly thought, wow, we should take this a lot seriously. So, yeah, very good. Those two watches they're on pre-order now. And of course, there's an additional discount if you use the code word Peter, P-E-T-R as well. Anyway, big thanks, of course, to RAC Watches, to Jetcraft, to Track Ninja, and to OEM Exclusive for their support, and you, the viewer, for watching. See you tomorrow as we look back then at the Qatar Grand Prix, penultimate round of the 2025 World Championship.